The snow had started falling hours earlier, soft at first, almost polite, the kind that looks beautiful through a window. By the time Callum Reyes stepped onto the platform, it had turned aggressive, thick flakes driven sideways by a wind that seemed determined to push every living thing back indoors. The small Montana train station looked like a forgotten outpost, one dim street lamp, a flickering digital board, and a stretch of tracks disappearing into white darkness. Callum adjusted the collar of his coat and checked his watch. Late. Again. He wasn't supposed to be here. His plane out of Billings had been grounded, his rental car rerouted, and somehow he'd ended up chasing a last-minute train that now sat stubbornly delayed. For a man whose life ran on precision and contracts timed down to the minute, the chaos grated on him more than the cold. He exhaled slowly, breath clouding the air, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't change the weather. It never had. That was when he noticed her. At first, she blended into the shadows, just another shape hunched against the cold. But then she shifted, and the overhead light caught her face. Pale, tight with effort, her shoulders trembled despite the way she held herself straight, chin lifted like she refused to give the storm the satisfaction of seeing her bend. She sat on a metal bench dusted with snow, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a thin jacket. Callum could tell from a distance it wasn't warm enough. No one who grew up around winters like these made that mistake unless they hadn't had a choice. He hesitated. It would be easy to mind his own business. He'd spent years mastering the art of staying out of other people's problems. It kept things clean, simple, safe, but then the wind gusted harder, and she sucked in a sharp breath, curling inward for just a second before forcing herself still again. That did it. Callum crossed the platform, boots crunching against ice. Up close, he noticed the hospital badge swinging from her neck, half hidden beneath her coat. The word nurse jumped out at him, followed by a name, Lila Hart. "You're going to get hypothermia sitting out here like that," he said, keeping his voice low, careful not to startle her. She looked up quickly, eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. For a moment, he thought she might tell him off. Instead, she swallowed and said, "I'm fine." The lie didn't land. Her lips had a faint bluish tint, and her fingers trembled even as she clenched them into fists. Pride, he realized. Stubborn, admirable pride. "The train's delayed," she added, as if that explained everything. "They said it'll be here." Callum glanced at the board. It still read delayed, the time beneath it blinking uncertainly. He'd seen enough of these stations to know what that usually meant. "I've got a truck," he said. "It's warm. You don't have to go anywhere. Just warm up." Suspicion flickered across her face. She studied him carefully, taking in the broad shoulders, the worn boots, the way he stood like he was used to open land and long distances. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Callum what?" "Reyes." She considered that, weighing risk against reality. Another gust of wind answered for her, cutting through the platform with teeth. She flinched before she could stop herself. 5 minutes, she said finally. "That's all." Callum nodded. Fair. The walk to his truck felt longer than it was. Snow piled against their boots, and once, she stumbled slightly. He caught her elbow without thinking, his grip steady but gentle. She didn't pull away. Inside the truck, warmth blasted from the vents, fogging the windows almost instantly. Lila let out a shaky breath she'd clearly been holding for far too long. Callum handed her a travel mug from the cup holder. "Coffee," he said, still hot. She wrapped both hands around it, eyes closing as the heat seeped into her skin. "You're a lifesaver," she murmured, then opened her eyes and gave a tired smile. "Occupational hazard, I guess. I don't say that lightly." Callum watched color slowly return to her cheeks. "You're a nurse," he said, nodding at the badge. "Travel nurse," she corrected. "Or I was, at least until tonight." Something in her tone told him there was more to that sentence, but he didn't push. Silence settled between them, not awkward, just quiet. The kind that made space instead of filling it. When the station loudspeaker crackled to life, both of them tensed. "Attention passengers," the automated voice droned, distorted by static. "Due to severe weather conditions, the incoming train has been cancelled. We apologize for the inconvenience." Lila stared straight ahead, knuckles whitening around the mug. "Cancelled." Callum swore under his breath. "That figures." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Of course it is. You got someone picking you up?" he asked. She shook her head. "My ride cancelled earlier. Phone died right after." She glanced at the snow piling against the windshield. "I was supposed to be 2 towns over by midnight." Callum leaned back in his seat, considering. The ranch was 40 minutes away, closer than the nearest motel, which was likely booked or inaccessible by now anyway. "You can stay at my place tonight," he said, as naturally as if he were offering directions. "Guest house. You'll have your own space." She turned to him slowly. "That's very kind, but you don't know me." "True," he admitted, "but I know you shouldn't be sleeping on a train bench in this weather." Her gaze searched his face, looking for something, an angle, a threat, a reason to say no. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found the opposite, because her shoulders relaxed just a little. "Okay," she said quietly. "Just for tonight." The drive out of town was silent at first, snow swirling in the headlights like 1,000 tiny ghosts. Then, without looking at him, she said, "I didn't plan to end up here." "Most people don't," Callum replied. She smiled at that, a real one this time. "I'd just finished a double shift. Emergency room. Thought I could make it through one more night of travel." "You save lives all day and forget to look after yourself," he said. She shrugged. Someone has to be last on the list. The ranch lights appeared through the snow like a promise. When he parked, Callum noticed she looked steadier now, less like she might disappear into the cold if he blinked. As he showed her to the guest house, she paused at the door, snowflakes melting in her hair. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. Really? Callum nodded, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Get some rest, he said. Storm should pass by morning. As he walked back toward the main house, the wind still howled, the snow still fell, but for the first time that night, the cold didn't seem quite as sharp. Morning arrived quietly, as if the storm had worn itself out in the night and decided not to make a scene. Pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, settling gently over the ranch and turning the snow into a wide, shimmering field. Callum woke before his alarm, a habit drilled into him by years of early mornings and responsibility. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sound of calm after chaos. His first thought surprised him. He wondered if Lila had slept well. Callum dressed quickly and moved through the house with practiced ease, starting a pot of coffee before pulling on his coat. Outside, the air was sharp but no longer hostile. Snow clung to fence posts and cattle roofs like quiet witnesses. He took a long breath, grounding himself in the familiar smell of earth and pine. The guest house sat a short distance from the main home, smoke rising faintly from its chimney. Relief flickered through him. She was awake, warm. He knocked lightly, giving her time. When the door opened, Lila stood there in borrowed flannel, her dark hair loose and still damp, like she'd just washed it. She looked different in daylight, softer, less guarded, but her eyes were just as alert. Good morning, she said. Morning, he replied, suddenly aware of how loud his boots sounded against the porch. I made coffee, thought you might want some real food, too. Her smile came easily this time. You're officially my favorite stranger. Inside, the guest house was modest but comfortable. She followed him back to the main house, and they sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs. Outside, the ranch stretched endlessly, white and untouched. This place is beautiful, Lila said, gazing out the window. Callum shrugged. It's home. She studied him over the rim of her cup. You say that like it means something different to you than it does to most people. He paused. No one usually noticed things like that. I grew up here, he said. Left for a while, came back. That usually means something pulled you back, she said gently. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, how long have you been traveling? 3 years, she replied. Short contracts, new hospitals, new cities. She hesitated. It's easier than staying. Callum understood that more than he expected to. Later that morning, he drove her into town so she could check in at the clinic. The roads were still slick, but the storm had cleared enough to make travel possible. Lila stared out the window as they passed fields and fences, her expression thoughtful. I was only supposed to be here one night, she said quietly. You can stay as long as you need, he answered, surprising himself with how sure he sounded. At the clinic, the staff greeted her like an old friend. Within minutes, she was discussing patient charts, rolling up her sleeves as if she'd never left. Callum watched from the doorway, struck by how naturally she stepped into the chaos. This was her world, urgent, compassionate, relentless. When she finally came back out, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with purpose, she laughed. They need help, badly. Looks like I'm staying a little longer. Something warm settled in Callum's chest. Guess the storm had plans for you. Days passed in a way that felt almost unreal. Lila worked long hours at the clinic, often coming home tired but animated, telling Callum stories about stubborn patients and small victories. He listened, really listened, something he hadn't done in a long time. In return, he showed her the ranch. How to mend a fence. Where the cattle liked to gather. The old oak tree where he used to sit as a boy, dreaming of leaving and swearing he'd never come back. She fit into the rhythms of the place effortlessly. Mornings with coffee, evenings with shared meals and quiet conversation. Laughter that echoed off wooden walls. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Lila grew quiet. I don't usually do this, she said suddenly. Do what? Callum asked. Stay, she replied. I move on before things get complicated. He met her gaze. And this feels complicated. She smiled sadly. It feels real. Callum considered that. Real doesn't have to mean painful. She looked away, watching the flames. It has before. Snow fell again that night, lighter this time, almost gentle. Lila stood by the window, arms crossed loosely, watching it drift down. I was supposed to leave home just for school, she said. Then life happened. My mom got sick. I became the reliable one. She laughed quietly. Now I'm always leaving before anyone can rely on me. Callum said nothing, letting the silence hold her words. You don't talk much about yourself, she added. I don't like people staying long enough to ask, he admitted. She turned to him, eyes soft. Funny how that works. The next morning, Callum found himself slowing down. Fixing fences took longer, errands into town multiplied. It wasn't intentional, not at first. But somewhere along the way, the ranch felt less empty when he knew she'd be back by evening. One afternoon, she joined him outside, bundled in a heavy coat. Teach me, she said, nodding toward the fence. He raised an eyebrow. You sure? Absolutely. She struggled at first, hands clumsy with the tools, but she didn't quit. When she finally managed it, she grinned like she'd just won a medal. I save lives, she said proudly. I can handle barbed wire. Callum laughed, the sound surprising them both. That night, they cooked together, bumping elbows in the kitchen, music playing softly in the background. It felt domestic in a way that made Callum's chest tighten. Later, by the fireplace, Lila spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I was only supposed to pass through. Callum didn't think before answering. Me too. The words hung between them, heavy and honest. Neither of them laughed. The stars came out the night Callum realized he was already in love. They appeared one by one above the ranch, bright and unashamed, stretching across the sky like they had nowhere else to be. Callum stood on the porch with a mug of cooling coffee in his hands, watching the lights flicker to life. Behind him, the house hummed softly, warm and occupied in a way it hadn't been in years. Lila was late, not late in the way that worried him, late in the way that meant she'd stayed at the clinic past her shift again, refusing to leave until the last chart was signed, the last patient reassured. He admired that about her, even as it tugged something protective loose in his chest. Headlights appeared at the end of the drive. Relief washed through him, followed by something quieter and deeper. She stepped out of the truck, tired but smiling, her breath fogging in the cold air. "You should have eaten without me," she called. "I waited," he replied simply. Inside, they shared dinner at the table, the conversation unforced. It struck Callum then how natural everything felt, like this was how life was supposed to be, not something borrowed or temporary. Over the next weeks, the town began to change around them. Word spread quickly in places like this. About the nurse who stayed. About the rancher who showed up at the clinic with supplies, asking what was needed and actually listening to the answer. Callum started attending town meetings he'd ignored for years. Lila started advocating for patients who had long learned not to expect much. Together, they became a quiet force. It wasn't dramatic at first. Just small things. A generator donated to the clinic. A reliable truck for patient transport. A spare room turned into temporary housing for someone who had nowhere else to go. One evening, as they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, Lila turned to him. "You know people talk." Callum smiled. "Let them." She studied his face. "You don't mind?" "No," he said honestly. "For once, it feels like they're talking about something that matters." Winter eased into spring, and with it came change that could no longer be ignored. Lila's contract ended. The email sat open on her laptop for days. Callum never asked about it, though he noticed the way she'd stare at the screen, jaw tight, before closing it again. He knew better than to push. Some decisions had to rise on their own. When she finally spoke, it was while they were repairing a gate together. "They offered me another assignment," she said. Callum kept working, his movement steady. "Where?" "Seattle." His chest tightened. "That's far." She nodded. 6 months. Good pay. Big hospital. "Do you want to go?" She hesitated. "I don't know what I want anymore." That night, Callum couldn't sleep. He walked the property under a moonlit sky, every fence and field heavy with memory. He had built his life around independence, around not needing anyone. And now the thought of her leaving felt like losing something essential. By morning, he knew what he had to do. He found her at the oak tree, the one he'd shown her weeks ago. She sat beneath it, legs tucked close, looking small against its massive trunk. "I never planned to stay either," he said, sitting beside her. "I built this place so I wouldn't have to depend on anyone." She listened, eyes steady. "But somewhere along the way," he continued, "you made it feel like something I wanted to share." Her breath caught. "I don't know where your path leads," he said. "But I know I want to walk it with you, if you'll let me." Tears filled her eyes. "Callum," he reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple ring, silver, understated, chosen not for its price but for its promise. "I don't need an answer today," he said. "Or tomorrow. I just need you to know I'm not passing through anymore." She laughed through her tears. "You do everything backwards, don't you?" "Usually," he admitted. "But this feels right." She said yes beneath the oak tree, her voice shaking, the wind carrying her answer into the open sky. They married in early summer, surrounded by neighbors, clinic staff, and people who had become family. There were no headlines, no cameras, just laughter, sunlight, and vows spoken with certainty. Marriage didn't slow them down. It gave them direction. Lila pushed for expanded care. Callum funded it, then stepped back, letting her lead. Mobile clinics rolled into towns that hadn't seen a doctor in years. Young nurses were offered scholarships in exchange for service. Retired doctors returned, drawn by a purpose bigger than prestige. The ranch became more than land. It became a hub. There were setbacks, equipment failures, funding challenges, nights when Lila came home exhausted and angry at a system that made helping people so hard. Callum learned to listen without fixing, to hold without solving. When reporters finally came, they expected a story about money. Instead, they found a story about partnership. "Why do this?" one journalist asked Callum. He glanced at Lila before answering. "Because someone once froze at a train station and didn't have to." Lila squeezed his hand. "And because someone stopped." The story spread beyond Montana. Grants followed. Other states took notice. Rural healthcare programs were modeled after theirs, quietly reshaping access across the region. Years later, the train station still stood, refurbished now, warm and well lit. A small plaque hung near the bench where Lila had once sat shivering. It read, "In honor of the night, kindness changed everything." Callum and Lila visited it once, standing hand in hand. "Funny," Lila said softly. "I almost missed that train." Callum smiled. "You didn't miss it. It just took you somewhere else." History would remember their work, their impact, their quiet revolution. But for them, it would always come back to one freezing night, one warm truck, and the choice not to walk away.